Welcome back. You're watching The Globe. Major international airlines have cancelled flights to the United States over the rollout of the G5 mobile phone technology that has triggered safety concerns, despite two wireless carriers saying that they will delay parts of the deployment.
In the US, the wavelengths for radio frequency for 5G are close to those used by instruments on aeroplanes to measure altitudes. Aviation watchdog, the Federal Aviation Administration, warns the potential interference could affect some aircraft's ability to make landings in bad weather, while the Airport Council International says the effects could be felt for weeks.
Based on currently available information, the resolution of these 5G issues sounds like it will be lengthy and gradual, taking place over weeks and months. In the meantime, passengers and shippers should expect delays and disruptions until the issues are fully resolved.
According to aviation experts, international carriers are particularly exposed because of the landing time needed to prepare flights and pre-position crews ready to fly intercontinental jets home.
We monitor the weather very closely. Because of the 5G restriction, there is the possibility during low visibility conditions that we may see diversions come to Tampa International Airport. And so overnight we leave additional gates open in the event we need to park aircraft that are unable to land at those other airports that end up diverting to Tampa. So we talk regularly with the National Weather Service, we keep a close eye on the weather, and we communicate regularly with the other airports in anticipation of what we may see during low visibility operations.
The frequency band that 5G uses is very similar to the frequency band that radar altimeters use, and there's possibility that there's interference or false signals with the 5G and a radar altimeter. So you can, what you would rely on with the radar altimeter giving you a certain altitude above the ground, it may be erroneous based on interference with 5G telephone frequencies.
On Tuesday, US telecoms giants AT&T and Verizon agreed to temporarily delay parts of the rollout around key airports. The move follows a warning that the use of the C-band spectrum for the deployment of 5G technology could wreak havoc on aircraft electronics.
Right, for more on this story, we're now joined by Linden Birns, the Managing Director of Plane Talking. Linden, thanks very much indeed for joining us. All right, put this into context for us, because I'm seeing commercials on television about 5G, and I'm thinking 4G was great, but 5G must be even better, surely.
Hi, good evening, Peter, to all the viewers as well. It's not that 5G in and of itself is problematic. What we've got here is really symptomatic of siloed government. We've got two government agencies, the Federal Aviation Administration, and then we've got the USA's equivalent of what we have in South Africa called ICASA, which is the federal body that allocates radio frequency spectrum to various operators. And for whatever reason, over the last 2 years, neither were talking to each other. And so, as you saw in that prelude clip, the nub of this is that the frequencies that have been allocated to the telecoms operators on which to run their 5G service are very close to the frequencies which aircraft radio altimeters use. And so there's bleed and interference. In other countries around the world, if we look at France, we look at South Korea, you look at other parts of the EU, what's happened is that they've allocated frequencies much further away from those used in aviation. And they've also limited the power output, the radiation output, if you like, of the 5G radio antenna on the ground, which they haven't done in the USA. As a result, you've got greater protection from 5G interference in many other parts of the world. And for whatever reason, in America, the two agencies weren't talking to each other. They weren't sharing information on best practice around the world. And now we're stuck with this particular problem where the solutions were either recall those radio frequencies, which would be enormously expensive to the cell phone telecoms operators because they've now invested billions in setting up all that infrastructure. Or you could say to all the aircraft operators, well, ground your aeroplanes and modify them or get new radio altimeters, which would be equally cost prohibitive. So now they're trying to find a compromise solution where they could cohabit. It means putting up buffers around airports, but that's very difficult when you've got an airport in a densely populated area, because the cell phone operators want to be able to serve as many people as possible. So maybe the solution that they'll end up finding is number one, certify as many of the radio altimeters as you possibly can. They've so far cleared 13 different models of that, affecting about 78% of the American fleet, but not the international fleet, airlines from other parts of the world flying into the USA. And also, by the way, this affects air ambulances, helicopters, which rely on radio altimeters to do night landings or landings in bad weather at hospitals. So what they've said today is you can operate a helicopter in bad weather or at night if you use night vision goggles, which is an infrared capability. But that's a huge investment if you don't already have that for your helicopter. So the ramifications of this are quite broad. Viewers may be interested to know that we face a similar situation a parallel situation here in South Africa with the Square Kilometre Array telescope. Several years ago, when South Africa won the bid to host the Square Kilometre Array, the Department of Science and Technology passed regulations and legislation that established a radio dead zone in the middle of the Karoo, except it's right under the air route, the main air route between Johannesburg and Cape Town. And if airlines were to require their crews to switch off their radio navigation aids, we'd have chaos, and it would be a huge threat to safety. And again, this is because the two government departments were not talking to each other, and they're only now trying to find a way to break that impasse.
Linden, United States of America is one of the most developed nations in the world. How is it possible that this could happen?
Hey, people make screw-ups. As I said, it does sort of raise eyebrows and beg a belief, but, big projects. And as I said, people just not talking to each other. It is quite bizarre, surreal, and now, of course, it's becoming hugely impactful in terms of economic impact, in terms of disruption to business, to tourists, to travelers, and to airlines themselves. A huge disruption. Some airports have been allowed to operate, but only in good weather. Airlines have been told they can also land, but only in good weather, unless the airport has been approved and there is an effective buffer around it now. But some of the big major airports like San Francisco and Chicago are still affected. And, this time last week we heard airlines like United saying that up to 15,000 of their flights could be affected. Over 1.25 million passengers would be affected with disrupted or diverted journeys. And that's just one airline, one of the big four airlines in America. A similar story across the others as well. So
help me understand, are some of the planes using some of this 5G technology? Is this where the interference starts to play in?
No, Peter, it's not. So what it is that you've got 5G technology on one hand used by the telecoms operators, and that relies on radio transmissions.
Right.
But the frequency on which those radio transmissions are being allowed to take place in America are very close to the frequencies which are used to operate radio altimeters, which is a piece of equipment on an aircraft that very precisely measures the height of an aircraft above terrain, and it also measures various wind phenomena like wind shear, which can be deadly if you fly into it unwittingly and without knowing. And the radio altimeter feeds information that supports a number of other systems that are crucial to navigation, to instrument landings and auto landings, and all sorts
Flying
of safety,
at night, I guess.
technology on an aircraft. And we don't want to have the interference of the radio interference from 5G interfering with aircraft.
Has there been leakage already that's been seen, and any incidents as a result?
There have been incidents of reported interference, and as a result, we've seen aircraft being put into holding patterns or diverted to other airports.
All right. South Africa, are we in this game at all? Have we sorted it out?
So we don't yet have 5G. One would hope that, the South African authorities, that the Civil Aviation Authority on one hand, Air Traffic Navigation Service, which is responsible for air navigation in the country, and ICASA, which allocates radio frequencies to the telecoms operators as well as to aviation, that those three bodies would be talking to each other when it comes to the future planning for the rollout of 5G in South Africa. So we avoid falling into the same traps that the Americans have landed themselves in.
So how did they sort out when 4G was rolled out? I guess there were conversations that happened much earlier. What was the difference?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm not an expert on the telecom side, and I don't think there was so much interference. Previously, our big concern was around GSM in the very early days of cell phones. And to this day, we still have regulations that require you to turn your phone onto airplane mode when you're flying. And that was around the fact that people would have a phone on board an aircraft which was live and trying to pick up signals. And you had aeroplanes that were in operation that predated the advent of GSM technology or cellular telephone technology. You had airplanes that had been built in the 80s or in the early 90s before the advent of cell phones. Their avionics and communication systems were not shielded from GSM or mobile telephone signals at the time. And so that was why it became necessary to rather introduce safety regulations that protected the lowest common denominator, the oldest aircraft, because most people from one day to the next don't know. When you get on an airplane, you have no idea what year it was manufactured, what particular model it is, unless you're a particular avgeek or aficionado. You sit down in your seat and assume that everything is fine and safe.
So where are we going with technology? Because this looks like something that's probably going to continue to be a question. 6G, I'm told, will probably come in, I don't know, within the next 10 years. That'll be another conversation. Then we've got 4G, 5G, 6G, all with frequencies. Sure. And what are we looking at in the years ahead?
Look, I don't think going forward it's going to be that we're going to see this sort of cock-up, to use frank language. I think people will learn from this. This is going to be very painful on a lot of people's pockets. And there's a lot of red faces. It's an embarrassment. And I think people will learn from it. I don't think we're going to see a repeat of this anytime soon. And they'll apply those lessons going forward.
How long do you think it's going to take for it to get sorted, and so that we don't see flights being cancelled and delayed?
Look, I think the real compounding problem at the moment is that this is happening in the middle of winter in America, where you've got blizzards and really foul weather and short days, long nights. So it really does put a lot more pressure on the system than if it had been happening in midsummer. Right. But the Federal Aviation Administration has been giving daily updates on the work they've been doing to try and clear and approve radio altimeters and different models of aircraft, commercial jetliners for use. And they're working quite hard to get that all done as quickly as they possibly can. But I think we're in for a few weeks of some disruption and buffeting.
Linden, thanks very much indeed for explaining this in terms that we can understand. Thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure, Peter.